Candlelight trembles against the dark wood of an old plantation hall. The air is heavy, sweet with magnolia, sour with memory. Somewhere, a door creaks, a shadow moves, a whisper dies before it's spoken. Behind the grand walls of southern plantations lay a secret history, one that polite society refused to speak of. They called them ladies, paragons of virtue, symbols of refinement. But beneath the lace and linen, power had a different face. Quick flashes the gloved hand of a woman gripping a key, the distant stare of an enslaved man standing too still, too silent. These are the hidden power crimes of the women history called respectable. And what happened behind those closed doors would never appear in the diaries they left behind. Cut to rolling fields, a wide veranda, the hum of insects beneath the southern sun. The 18th and 19th centuries built a world on ownership. Every life measured in profit, every body in investment. Men ruled the land, but inside the home, another kind of ruler watched the mistress. In public, she was quiet, contained, graceful, the embodiment of domestic order. But in private, her authority could be terrifying. Within those walls, she could reward or destroy, command or humiliate. In a world that denied women power, some learned to wield what power they had in silence, and sometimes, in darkness. The house was her kingdom. Every servant's step, every word, every breath was under her control. A glance from her could mean punishment. A word could decide a life. It wasn't only the master's whip that ruled the plantation, it was the mistress's will. She governed the rhythm of suffering in the home. She managed obedience through hunger, fear, and quiet manipulation. Night falls. A candle still burns. Footsteps echo. A key turns in a lock. And sometimes, that power demanded silence about what happened after dark. What began as control over labor often blurred into control over the body, and control over the body became control over the soul. For many white mistresses, trapped within loveless marriages and suffocating gender roles, the enslaved became both witness and target. In the private chambers where hierarchy met humiliation, domination took a new and twisted form. These encounters were not romance, they were not passion. They were acts of coercion, a performance of ownership that stripped another human being of choice, of dignity, consent. Consent cannot exist where freedom does not. Historians later uncovered coded letters, cryptic diary entries, a favored servant, a trusted companion, a boy who stayed close. Words that hid more than they revealed. Every euphemism was a wound, covered and cataloged by genteel language. But beneath the words, the truth bled through. And for the enslaved men forced into these silent arrangements, the cost was unbearable. They lived within two cages, one built by law and another built by fear of speaking. To survive, they buried the truth so deep that even their children couldn't name it. Some stories surfaced only in whispers. Generations later, family secrets that surfaced through trembling confessions, unspoken shame passed down like an inheritance. Because buried stories have a way of rising back to the surface. The deeper historians looked, the more the silence began to crack. Letters between families hinted at disappearances. Property ledgers listed names marked with stars, a quiet sign that someone had been transferred without reason. The past does not vanish. It hides in margins, in code, in handwriting that trembles when the truth comes too close. By the late 1800s, fragments of these secrets surfaced in archives. A mistress's diary torn at the edges, a testimony buried in court files, interviews conducted during the WPA era, where once enslaved people spoke cautiously, half-phrases loaded with meaning. A man remembered being ordered to keep company in the big house. Another spoke of a mistress who liked to talk at night. Their words were spare, their pauses louder than any confession. These weren't stories of affection. They were records of power disguised as routine, a kind of control that stole more than labor, it stole peace of mind. For the enslaved, silence was survival. Speaking could mean punishment, or worse, being sold away. So the truth lived in the shadows, beneath generations of forced forgetfulness. Each man who endured this carried an invisible wound, a shame not of his making, but one placed upon him by a system designed to strip him of self. The cruelty was psychological as much as physical. To be forced into obedience while pretending choice. To carry guilt for acts born only from coercion. To exist as both human and object, punished for both strength and submission. The plantation was not a world of passion, it was a theater of power. And in that theater, every role was written by those who owned the stage. Cut to visuals, worn papers, cracked ink, portraits fading under dust. By the early 20th century, historians began unearthing what polite society tried to erase. Scholars studying gender and slavery uncovered patterns. The coded language of favorites, companions, and trusted attendants reappeared again and again across plantation documents. History began to speak not in confessions, but in patterns. The same phrases, the same silences, the same erasures. Together, they told a story no one wanted to hear. The question shifted from, did it happen? To, why was it hidden? White Southern women had long been portrayed as moral guardians, innocent bystanders in the violence of slavery. But truth broke through those myths. They were not powerless, they were participants in a hierarchy that rewarded domination in all its forms. In a world where womanhood was defined by control of the home, cruelty became a form of expression. Some found purpose in mastery, others found escape through command. But behind every act of control was another act of silence. Silence enforced upon those who could not resist, and silence chosen by those who feared their own reflection. They had the privilege to rewrite their guilt into grace. The enslaved had no such luxury. Generations later, this buried truth bled into memory, reshaping family histories. In some Southern towns, descendants unknowingly shared ancestry, born of coercion and silence. In the bloodlines of the South lies a story no textbook dared to tell. A story where power did not simply divide it entangled. Visuals shift, archival images overlaid with modern streets, voices echoing over the hum of city life. Time buried the evidence, but not the echo. It lives in names, in skin, in the uneasy quiet that still follows when the topic turns to history's hidden crimes. The emotional toll remains heavy. For the men forced into silence, the past became a ghost that haunted their sons and grandsons. Shame taught through silence, fear passed like a language of survival. Trauma travels quietly. It hides in mannerisms, in the way families avoid certain subjects, in the stories left untold. Each generation inherited fragments, a glance, a rumor, a name whispered with hesitation. Yet through it all, the truth waited, unacknowledged, demanding voice. What happens when a crime has no witnesses willing to speak, and a history built on lies refuses to listen? The rediscovery of these stories forced a reckoning. Scholars and descendants began piecing together what the archives had buried. Each uncovered document felt like a wound reopening, a whisper finally being heard after centuries of silence. It was not just the men who suffered, it was their legacy denied, distorted, forgotten. To acknowledge them is to challenge the entire myth of gentility that cloaked slavery's cruelty. What happens when history finally admits that even its most refined faces were capable of unspeakable control? When the silence finally broke, it didn't come from the powerful, it came from the descendants, the archivists, the storytellers who refused to keep pretending. They looked at the faded portraits of elegant white women and asked the question history had avoided for centuries. What did she do when no one was watching? The truth does not vanish when it is denied. It waits buried in paper, in memory, in bloodlines that carry the echo of crimes never confessed. As researchers dug through diaries and estate records, the lies of refinement unraveled. Beneath the embroidered words, grace, virtue, and hospitality lay another vocabulary: ownership, domination, secrecy. Letters written by mistresses to one another spoke of discipline and special attendance, coded phrases that historians now recognize as signals of control that went far beyond labor. The house was not a sanctuary, it was a stage where power dressed itself in lace and perfume. For the men who endured this invisible form of slavery, freedom could never come from escape alone. Their bodies were freed, but their voices remained imprisoned by humiliation, the kind that turns truth into a lifelong burden. To be a man in a world that denied your right to choose, that stripped even your pain of dignity, that is a silence too deep to measure. The legacy of that silence still lingers. In the generations that followed, entire communities grew under the shadow of a history they were never allowed to discuss. Children sensed it in their elders' pauses, in the way certain questions were deflected. Who was she? Why do we have their name? Questions met with averted eyes, and the soft phrase, "It's complicated." Complicated. The narrator says softly, is the language of the unspoken. It is the sound of centuries refusing to look in the mirror. And yet, through time, the descendants of both oppressor and oppressed began confronting this buried truth. Some found shared ancestry across the color line, a reminder that blood remembers what history tries to forget. Others found rage not for the past itself, but for the silence that tried to erase it. The silence of the oppressed was survival. The silence of the powerful was protection. Both echo still. Modern historians, filmmakers, and artists began to reclaim what was stolen, not only the facts, but the humanity buried beneath them. Each recovered letter, each oral history, each restored name became an act of defiance against centuries of erasure. To tell these stories is to disturb the comfort of myth. But myths are only prisons when we mistake them for truth. The truth shattered the fragile illusions of Southern gentility. The image of the innocent white mistress, the moral angel of the home, collapsed under the weight of what she chose to hide. She was not powerless, she was protected. She was not merely a victim of patriarchy, she was a participant in domination. The voice grows heavier, intimate. Power does not excuse cruelty, and silence does not erase it. Today, the ruins of Plantation stand like ghosts, polished for tourists, dressed in nostalgia. But beneath the manicured lawns, bones still lie. The soil remembers. It always does. In the stillness of those fields, in the hush of the magnolias, there lingers the memory of voices denied. Each breeze is a reminder that truth, once buried, never stays quiet forever. The narrator pauses. The tone softens, as if mourning. The enslaved men who were forced into silence were not forgotten, only hidden. Their pain was written between the lines, in the spaces history refused to read. Cut to modern imagery, descendants, walking the same paths their ancestors once did. Scholars tracing names in dusty ledgers, a young historian whispering an apology to the wind. This is not just history, it is inheritance. And inheritance is not always made of gold or land, sometimes it is made of silence and sorrow. To expose these truths is not to shame the past, it is to free it. Because the stories we bury do not die, they wait, patient and restless, until someone finally listens. The tone grows somber, almost whispering. For centuries, the narrative of slavery was told through the lens of power: men in portraits, women in pearls, the enslaved in chains. But power is never the whole story. The real story lives in what was hidden, in the quiet terror of obedience, in the forced smile, in the silence that screamed louder than any whip. Now, the music fades to a low hum, a single note of mourning. The past is not gone, it's beneath our feet, inside our blood, stitched into our names. Every untold truth waits to be heard. Every silence is a story waiting to be spoken, a beat of stillness. Then, the final reflection: white mistresses of slavery wrote diaries filled with virtue and grace, but the enslaved men they ruled left no such pages. Their truths were carried in scars and silences, in memories passed through generations who never knew why they feared the dark. The voice lowers, slow and deliberate. To acknowledge them now is to undo the lie that power ever equals purity. It is to say, we see you, we hear you. Your silence was never consent. Soft, fade, plantation dissolving into a modern skyline, the hum of a city over the whisper of the past. Final words. The disturbing truth of history is not that it happened, it's that it was hidden. But the silence is ending. The reckoning has begun.